Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a first look at an upcoming tier 9 French heavy tank, the Sentinel. This tank is a peculiar one because it has actually been in the game files for coming up to about a year now. However, it was kind of forgotten about. They kind of added it in, everything had standard textures, and they forgot about it. And then in the last couple of weeks, they've picked it up again, revitalized it, given it a lovely and brand new HD model, and they've changed some things about it. So if you've ever seen it in the past, well, it's now very different. So, what has changed? Well, first of all, they've given this thing a new turret. This new turret has spaced armor on, and it's definitely affected the tank's survivability. However, they hadn't particularly changed its firepower, but they have improved it, so it is now better. The Sentinel is going to have an almost Barask-style autoloader clip. So, it's going to have a DPM of 1700, which I must say isn't particularly incredible. However, it does have 2 rounds of 390 alpha damage, which it can put out every 25-ish seconds. So that kind of compensates for the poor DPM because its DPM is wrapped up into one clip, which is going to be doing a pretty substantial amount of damage. We're talking 780 damage here over a clip. That's pretty substantial, and, that is why tanks like the Barask are so good, for example. However, will this work on a heavy tank? We're going to see. So, 390 alpha, 2 rounds, a total reload for its 2 rounds of 25 seconds, and an intraclip reload, a very familiar intraclip reload for French tanks of 2.5 seconds. So every 2.5 seconds, out of your 25-second reload, you can do 390 alpha, 2.5 seconds, 390 alpha, which is nice. However, things that the Sentinel suffers with is the same as any autoloader. It suffers incredibly when it does not have those 2 rounds. It means it is incredibly vulnerable, and good players will just push it. So I always feel that autoloaders nowadays really do struggle in today's meta when people are familiar with their gimmick and they count the shells and then they will just push you if you are vulnerable. That's where auto reloaders, for example, the same mechanic that the Progettos, the Italian mediums in the Italian heavies have, is just so much more favorable because you can get shots back in between your total reload, which is just simply much more comfortable. However, the Barask style mechanic is great in a situation where you can play like an assassin, where you can play off the flank, you can peek, you can put your shots in, you can fall back, and you can reload safely. Is it going to be able to do that with its penetration and aim time and dispersion? Let's have a look. So, penetration, 258mm standard, AP, that's okay. It will work, especially when you are playing against tier 9 and tier 8 tanks. However, as soon as you get tiered up to tier 10, 258 standard AP is going to struggle. Is its gold any better? Well, slightly. 303mm APCR gold is lovely when you are fighting those tier 9, tier 8 games. However, will struggle against those tier 10 tanks just because 303, you need about 310 to reliably pen some of the weakest weak spots of tier 10 heavies, especially with this being a heavy tank. Is its gun handling going to be a mitigating factor? Well, yes, kind of actually. 2.3 seconds aim time is on the lower end and will mean you have to perfectly aim your shot in between each round within your clips. Obviously, 2.5 second intraclip, 2.3 seconds reload. So you will be fully aimed if you're able to hold your reticle completely still between each shot in your intraclip. However, not much margin for error there. So if you need to re-aim or you need to select a different target in between your shots, 2.3 will feel pretty bad, but generally it will work. Dispersion-wise, it's okay actually. 0.35 is pretty nice, especially if you were to run V-stabs on this tank. It would pull some of those soft dispersion statistics up, and it will just make this thing feel a little bit more snappy. Especially as this thing is an auto reloader, so it has 2 rounds where you are probably going to need to be dragging your shots. You're probably going to need to be, selecting different targets to, put one shot into this tank, one shot into this tank. V-stabs will be great for that, but this thing's dispersion of 0.35 will allow it to be able to do that when it works with its reload. When it works with its reload and its aim time that work a little bit in, tandem. A gun depression of 8 degrees is okay, very much workable. This thing looks quite low profile, so 8 degrees will actually be quite nice. It's not 10 degrees though, that's what I always say. Mobility wise, 45 forwards is actually pretty nice nowadays. Anything, basically 45 is the lower end of what you want, because if you run a turbo, you pull it over 50, which is kind of where you want to be to keep up with the ever-growing, speed of games. Reverse speed 15, average, anything higher than 15 is just quality of life, really. HP wise, 1700 is okay. It's basically bang average, maybe slightly on the lower end for tier 9 heavies. Its armor, however, is where I think this thing might struggle a little bit. Hull armor, particularly 90 millimeters. Yes, I think it looks pretty angled on the upper plate, so maybe that will be okay. However, its lower plate is huge, looks very flat and very square. So if this thing is driving straight at you, yeah, I think its lower plate is going to be pretty much your favorable target. However, its upper hull might be weak to heat, high pen heat, maybe 330 millimeters plus. But obviously, we don't get to see. We can kind of just take a guess. In terms of turret armor, 240 millimeters actually looks quite nice. It looks like it's got spaced armor, so that will be pretty nice against heat. However, it does have a cupola that does look relatively sized, and especially looks like when you move your gun down, it will still be visible. So when you are using your gun depression to work a ridgeline, it does look like its cupola is still going to be visible, but it does look particularly flat. This thing's turret does look like it might be vulnerable to high pen AP. So, for example, a Hori. Just because of its space protection, I think it will be pretty weak. However, heat rounds obviously will be kind of caught by that, but it does look like there's kind of like areas below the gun, above the hull, where heat could maybe just simply penetrate. So, in general, this thing looks okay in terms of its survivability. As I said, it got this brand new turret when they kind of brought this tank back to life. And its new turret definitely looks better just because of its spaced protection. However, yeah, could be better, could be worse, right? But let's compare it now. So let's compare the Sentinel to the TNH TVZ, which is the tier 9 Czech tech tree heavy, and the Object 752, which is the tier 9 Soviet, or the USSR, Russian, premium heavy tank as well. All are quite similar. So all have an autoloader. So all basically fire their shells and then have a long reload to reload all their shells. So, in terms of DPM, the Sentinel sits smack bang between the TNH and the 752. 752 having 1737 at the top end, the TNH at 1613 at the bottom end, the Sentinel smack bang in the middle with 1701. As I said, it's pretty average. However, its DPM is not comparable to something that is a single shot just because its DPM is very much wrapped up within its clip. So, 390 Alpha is identical to the 752, however doesn't match up to the TNH's lovely 440, but 390 in today's meta is quite nice, especially when you are putting two of those shots out for 780. However, only having 2 rounds of that is becoming a little bit of a rarity. You have to look at tanks like the Charmerat, which we've had recently, and, for example, tanks like the 752. They all seem to have had 3 rounds. Having a 2-round autoloader seems to be a little bit of a rarity nowadays. And yes, it's great, and we know it's a brilliant mechanic because it works on tanks like the Barask. However, that's a Barask, a medium tank which has camo, and can play that assassin role. This is a heavy tank. This is a heavy tank which has to play like a heavy tank. It has to brawl. Having 2 rounds does leave it a little bit vulnerable, I feel. Whereas the 752 having 3 rounds of 390 gives it that extra clipping power. You can clip for 1,000, right? And clipping for 1,000 is just so much more nice than clipping for only 780. And it will deter tanks from pushing you, and there will be a lot more scenarios where something can't push you because you could clip it. Whereas, only having 2 rounds of 390 and having 780, there will be a lot more occasions where they could just tank your 2 shots and kill you, or, wait for you to fire those 2 shots and then just push you. So, reload time, the Sentinel has the best. However, as I did say, it does lack an extra shell or lacks the alpha compared to the TNH and the 752. In terms of dispersion, the Sentinel is the clear winner. 0.35, as I said, is actually really quite nice for a heavy tank at tier 9, especially one with an autoloader. Compare that to the TNH's 0.4 and the Object 752's abysmal 0.42. You will actually feel like you can hit your shots in this tank at medium to long range, which is a nice thing for an autoloader. it should be able to do that role, because at the end of the day, this thing can't particularly play on the front line, be that single shot automatic brawler where things just don't push you because you have DPM. It can't do that. It has to play the second line and like an assassin or at long range and pick those chancy cross shots. Aim time, once again, the Sentinel is winning pretty clearly here. 2.3 compared to 2.7, and the 7.52 is abysmal 3.4. As I said, quite nice. Mobility, once again, smack bang between the TNH and the Object 7.52. 7.52 is slow, very slow. You have to run a turbo on it. TNH is pretty quick. You can sometimes, in some matchups, get away without running a turbo. The Sentinel will kind of sit in that smack bang range where it will almost be personal preference if you want a turbo. Personally, I would run a turbo because I think 45 is slow. Pulling it up to 50 is just almost like the bare minimum, in my opinion. But 45 is going to be okay, and you will be able to keep up, and you will be able to play that assassin role where you get to the second line, you can maybe peek out, put your 2 rounds in between somebody's reload because they got there first and fired. So you can kind of get the idea. Gun depression, 8 degrees is lovely. You know, we don't need to talk too much about that. HP, as I said, 1700 is pretty average nowadays. It really isn't great. Compare that to the TNH is lovely, 1900, and the 7.52 is 1750. The Sentinel is a candidate for running hardening on. Absolutely 100%. 1700 will not allow you to trade particularly effectively, whereas tanks like the TNH can do better and the 7.52 slightly better. It will not allow you to trade particularly effectively to put your 2 rounds out. So it will mean that you have to play a lot more passive and not take one shot in turn for usually your 2. There will have to be more occasions where you don't take anything in return to do your 2 to play particularly well in this tank. But it's still workable, right? You run hardening, you're pulling it up to 1900, which is definitely workable. View range, it actually has the best for some reason, which is, strange, but that tends to be a little bit of a trend with French heavies or French tanks in general. They just have better view range. Armor, okay. Here's where the Sentinel starts to fall back a bit. It almost seems a little bit like a slow medium. Faster in terms of its armor, right? 90 on the hull is really not great, as we said. That lower plate looks huge, and I don't think it's going to be particularly strong in general. Its turret looks okay on paper. However, as I said, looks weak to AP. Whereas you compare the hull and the turret armor to things like the TNH, which has really quite nice upper hull armor, only really struggling with its lower plate again, and its turret armor, which is absolutely lovely, of 300mm, only having a small cupola, and a 7.52, which has 2 cupolas on its turret. However, its frontal turret is lovely, and its hull very well angled. The Sentinel does struggle compared to those 2, and it will definitely feel weaker, and you will simply just struggle a lot more with its armor. But there's trade-offs, right? Better gun handling, better armor. So you might have to peek for slightly less time to get your shots off, meaning you might not take that shot in the first place. Penetration-wise, ignore that. That is not 2,658. That is 265mm of penetration, which is actually really quite nice. As I said, that, beats the TNH and the 7.52 out the water pretty cleanly. 265 compared to 252 and 240, just no real comparison there. The 240 for the 752 is abysmal. That thing has to rely so much on its gold ammo, which it does have lovely gold ammo, the 752. 310 is the best here. However, the gold pen for the Sentinel of 303 very much works. However, as I did say, it will struggle when it gets up tier to those tier 10 games, and it has to pen those weak points. However, Tier 9, Tier 10, Tier 9 and Tier 8 matchups completely works. And, it beats the TNH's 294 APCR, which does lack anything less than 300 at Tier 9. Really does struggle nowadays. But there you go. That's the Sentinel, the upcoming Tier 9 French heavy tank. I think it looks pretty good. As to when we're going to see this tank, God knows. I reckon this thing might be a Battle Pass collaboration, personally. It kind of has all the hallmarks of being a decent tank, having a unique-ish mechanic, but I feel like it would slot pretty perfectly into a Battle Pass collaboration, probably in the summer to maybe autumn time. I think that would be a pretty good way to introduce this tank. Overall, I think it looks good to average. I think a good player with a great understanding of how autoloaders work and positions will have a great time in this tank. However, players who maybe lack a bit of experience, a little bit of map knowledge, and a bit of understanding how autoloaders work will struggle, because this tank just doesn't necessarily have the armor, the mobility to get them out of those situations where they might get themselves into a little bit more than a great player in autoloaders would. But there you go. That's the Sentinel. Do let me know what you think about this tank down below in the comments. Let's have a conversation. And yeah, I'll see you all again very soon.